Welcome back to the FHIR in 5. In this session, we're going to have a look at the letter N, and I've decided to pick narrative, looking at how we can display human-readable narrative within our FHIR resources. So when we're used to looking at FHIR resources, we're thinking about the discrete elements or the atomic data elements that are part of that particular FHIR resource. But resources can also contain narrative elements, that human-readable content. Not all FHIR resources have this narrative, so you won't see it in bundles, binary or parameters, but the rest of the FHIR resources will. And the narrative is just a summary of the specific resource, and it's used to convey information in a human-readable way to a human. Here's a quote directly from the above website. So it should reflect all of the content needed for a human to understand the essential clinical and business information of that FHIR resource. So we should be able to just display the clinical narrative to the user without having to display the discrete data elements contained within the FHIR resource. It should be safe to do so. So status codes are really important. There's 4 different status codes that we get to see. The typical one that you'll see in most FHIR server implementations is generated. It just means the FHIR server has generated this payload from this narrative from the payload of the FHIR resource. The extensions one is very similar. It's generated automatically by the FHIR server and it comes from the payload, but also the extensions that are within this payload. The really important status code that you need to keep an eye on is the additional status code, and that means that there's some content within this narrative that that's not part of the payload itself. So you should be really displaying that information to the user so that they can get that additional human-readable content that's not part of the payload. And then empty if there's no human-readable version of this. You'll see that the empty status, but normally you'll see generated. It's just that additional one you just need to keep track of. So there's an example of what an example of a narrative would look like inside the div. You can use an XHTML format for representing that. Have a look at the specification to see what tags you can use, what formatting options you can use to display content back to the user, and certainly consider using it when you are displaying content back to the user. If you wanted a summary of certain parts of a FHIR resource, it's a great place to go and look, remembering that it is that summary for business and clinical users in a human readable form. So hopefully you can understand a little bit more about how narratives work in a FHIR context. Again, just be really careful about that additional status code to make sure you don't miss important information going back to the user.